We begin with breaking news. The RCMP is no longer pursuing criminal charges against Nigel Wright, the Prime Minister's former Chief of Staff, who cut a $90,000 check to Senator Mike Duffy. The RCMP releasing this statement just minutes ago saying this. I'll show you it as it brings up on the board. In June of 2013, the RCMP's National Division initially launched an investigation into Nigel Wright with respect to the $90,000 gift to Senator Mike Duffy. When the RCMP initiated the investigation, there were sufficient grounds to pursue the matter with regards to offenses of breach of trust, bribery, frauds on the government, as well as receiving prohibited compensation, contrary to the Parliament of Canada Act. But upon completion of the investigation, we have concluded, says the RCMP, the evidence gathered does not support criminal charges against Mr. Wright. And so ends a very long tale. Peter Mantis, which is the spokesperson, the lawyer for Nigel Wright, has just released this statement. Do we have the Mantis or the PMO here? This is the Prime Minister's office just released this. We're pleased the RCMP has made progress in their work. The Prime Minister's office will continue offering every possible assistance to the RCMP's investigation. That's the equivalent of a sigh of relief from the Prime Minister's office, clearly. And here's now from Peter Mantis, Nigel Wright's lawyer, who is making a statement on behalf of Nigel Wright. I think we've got that as well. Do we have that? Well, let me just see if I can read you that. It was just sent to me seconds ago here. Nigel Wright has been advised, my intention was to secure the repayment of taxpayer funds. I believe that my actions were always in the public interest and lawful. The outcome of the RCMP's detailed and thorough investigation has now upheld my position. That's from the lawyer representing Nigel Wright. We will have much more on this dramatic development in the PMO Senate scandal. The RCMP no longer pursuing charges against Nigel Wright. What does that mean for Mike Duffy? The power panel standing by. But we've also got our eye on Ukraine. The situation in Ukraine is escalating as there is genuine fears now that a civil war will break out. The Ukrainian government said today its special forces have recaptured a small airport in the east of the country that had been occupied by pro-Russian militia. It's the first Ukrainian military action since the crisis began. Now, over the weekend, pro-Russian forces seized control of a number of buildings and cities near the Russian border. Canada and other Western governments believe Russia is actively encouraging the separatists. Putin has denied any role in the crisis. Is Ukraine really on the brink of war? Is Russia behind the insurgencies? And what should Canada do? What should NATO do? Joining me now from Winnipeg, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Defence, James Bezan. In Montreal, Liberal Foreign Affairs critic Marc Garneau, and in Ottawa, NDP Foreign Affairs critic Paul Dewar. Mr. Bezan, yesterday on the program, the Ukrainian ambassador to Canada, Vadim Prystaiko, said locals are arming themselves. The next step could be civil war. What's your read?
Well, definitely things continue to heat up, and what we're seeing is continued aggression like we saw in Crimea. You have special ops from Russia functioning on the ground, orchestrating the militias. They're paying dollars to people, $500 US if you want to go and occupy a building and storm a government building, 500 hryvnia, which is about $40 if you want to be a protester. So they're all orchestrating this very succinctly from Moscow, out of the Kremlin. They're using their influence in the region, and of course, if you see all the video, these are the same looking militia that we saw down in Crimea before the referendum took place, and the full-fledged occupation that we have in Crimea. So now what we have is the identical situation unfolding on the ground in what has always been Ukrainian territory, and this is unacceptable to all the Western allies in Europe, in NATO, and in the G7.
All right, let me just tell all of you now in our audience, I've just received from a government source that the Deputy Minister of the Foreign Affairs, Daniel Jean, has called in the Russian ambassador, Mammadov, to express Canada's frustration with the Russian government over the troubling situation in eastern Ukraine. Apparently, the Deputy Minister made it clear that these attacks are coordinated, and the Russian Federation denial of involvement is not credible. The deputy called on the ambassador to urge the government of Moscow to urgently de-escalate the situation. And Canada, it says, is prepared to take further steps to isolate the Russian Federation politically and economically. So let me just confirm that. This is what a government source is telling me. Mr. Bezan, one, the government's position is that Russia is clearly behind these and you're prepared to take further steps in terms of sanctions?
Yes, and so as the Deputy Minister demarched the Russian ambassador this afternoon, as you also know, Environment Minister Leonid Glukok has instructed our officials that we will not be attending the working group meeting in Moscow for the Arctic Council. We will continue to make all steps possible to isolate Russia on a global scale. If they continue to support these types of efforts to destabilize Ukraine, to ensure that there isn't a federal election, a presidential election on May 25th, and create bloodshed and unrest throughout the region, there's no way that Canada will stand by idly without pulling all the diplomatic levers. And as Prime Minister Harper did today, he called the Prime Minister of Latvia to offer our support and best wishes, and also to continue the work that's going to take place next week when Foreign Minister John Baird visits Latvia, Estonia, the Czech Republic, and Poland.
Paul Dewar, what's your reaction now to the government talking to the Russians, what they've said to the Russians, the possibility of further sanctions, and now what you see in terms of the Russian response here?
Right. Well, first of all, that's what you do in diplomacy, and I think it's appropriate that you bring in the ambassador and articulate your policy. We also need to take a look at what's happening, with our allies. And as you know, talks are coming up this week, and so we're going to see a lot of posturing. What we need to do is we need to be very clear and direct with the Russians, and also challenge them on there's a very interesting meeting at the Security Council this past weekend, and the Russians called for it. And what did they say? They said they wanted to bring UN peacekeepers to Ukraine. Now, Ban Ki-moon has said, well, no, we're not going to do that. But what we should do is take that opportunity to say, no, then let in observers throughout the country and to Crimea. So when the Russians are saying that they want to bring in peacekeepers to Ukraine to protect minorities, I think this is where we should challenge them and say, yes, let's bring in observers and let's have them throughout the country, because as you know, they denied access to the OSCE observers, the Russians did, to Crimea. So I think this is part of what's ramping up to Thursday into the meetings, is that we have to have very solid positions and very clear positions. And I think one of the things we need to do, as was mentioned by James, we've got the elections coming up, is to make sure there's international presence on the ground to support the Ukrainians. And finally, if I can say, to date, we have to give credit to the Ukrainians who have been quite, I think, disciplined in terms of reaction. And what we're seeing now is that there are towns, as has been noted, that have been subject to the same kind of model we've seen in Crimea. And they have every right to go in and to very calmly but smartly get in there and retake the, get access back from these places, because clearly this is the strategy that the Russians have deployed, and clearly it has to be challenged, and that's something that we have to support our allies with.
Where are you on this, Mr. Garneau? John Baird saying these are clearly brazen and coordinated actions. Where are you on what's happening in Canada or NATO's response?
Well, I remember a few weeks ago, Russian Ambassador Mammadov bristling with indignation at the thought that the West could in any way think that Russia would interfere with Ukraine. Well, his credibility is completely shot. The reality, unfortunately, is that the tension is ratcheting up at this point. This is a potentially dangerous situation. There's no question in my mind that Russia is whipping up the pro-Russian separatists in those 10 centers where they've occupied buildings and police stations. It's a time for cool heads to prevail. Ukraine is perfectly entitled, in the interests of good order and peace, to try to retake these government buildings that have been taken over, but this certainly does ratchet up the tension at this point, and it is important that things don't get out of hand, because once the bloodshed begins to occur, this has a way of exponentially ratcheting up.
Jens, if I could, I want to turn your attention as we watch Ukraine very closely. I want to go back to Parliament Hill. Just as we began this program, we confirmed that the RCMP will not be pursuing charges against Nigel Wright, the Prime Minister's former Chief of Staff. The RCMP then going on to confirm this. Let me just start with you quickly, Mr. Dewar.
Yeah.
We talked about this issue a lot. What do you make of this? Does this put Mr. Harper in the clear? What's your take on this?
Well, no. I mean, if you're Nigel Wright, a sigh of relief. If you're the PMO, you're waiting for the next shoe to drop. Why? Because remember, during the whole investigation for Mr. Wright, the government hid behind the fact that there's the RCMP investigation. We're not going to, comment on certain other aspects of this. But, go back to, you already mentioned your program, and Mr. Mulcair mentioned, is the fact of the matter, this goes back to what? This goes back to the Prime Minister's office being engaged in what might be cover-up, right, what was political whitewash when it came to the Senate. Remember the Senate reports that were whitewashed by the Conservative members? And by the way, this residency requirement that senators have to have, that hasn't been dealt with. And finally, this opens the door for the Ethics Commissioner to come in and start doing their report. Because, of course, when the RCMP came in, the Ethics Commissioner said, okay, we have to put that to we'll pause on the Ethics Commission report and investigation. So that's on now. So if you're Nigel Wright, sigh of relief. If you're the PMO, you're going, they're holding their breath as to what's going to happen next.
James Bezan, it was the Prime Minister who not long ago was saying Nigel Wright was solely responsible for this. Nigel Wright as if distancing himself as far as possible from Nigel Wright. Then he said he fired Nigel Wright. Now there's no criminal charges. Will the Prime Minister rehire Nigel Wright?
Well, as it was already noted, the Ethics Commissioner has not finished her work yet. We're glad of the progress the RCMP has made, and I deferred to the RCMP for their comments on why they found that there is no wrongdoing here or enough to do criminal charges. And the Prime Minister's office will continue to cooperate fully with the RCMP as they carry out their investigation in the rest of the caseload that they have revolving around these other senators.
All right, last word to you, Mr. Garneau. Any reaction now that no charges against Nigel Wright?
Well, I think that Nigel Wright is relieved. He's not going to go to jail, even though he did write a $90,000 check to Mike Duffy. But this story is much more complicated than simply that fact. There's still a great deal of information to come forward. I look forward to finding out the truth.